Hello, in this video guide I want to introduce you to some introductory fundamental modeling tools and processes inside of Blender to create a interesting product shot. So this is where we're hoping to end up, a bowl of cherries on a table. So we're going to start with a new scene inside of Blender, a new project where we have our default cube, our default light, and our default camera. I'm going to leave the camera as it is, but I'm going to delete the light by pressing X. I'm also going to delete the default cube as well. And so I'm going to start by making this bowl, and we're going to do that by adding a new mesh. In this instance, it's going to be a cylinder. Now, with all of these primitives, they are these kind of default shapes. We know that we can scale and adjust and squish and stretch some of these primitives around. How do we actually start breaking in to further manipulate and edit these materials or these meshes, in fact? So I'm going to start by scaling this cylinder down and thinking about what it is that I'm actually making. So I'm making this bowl. So my starting point is going to be the base of this is the base of that bowl. But beyond scaling it any higher, I'm kind of restricted with those fundamental transform tools here into what I can do with the object. And that's because I'm still in object mode. But if I come up to the top here and switch to edit mode, we come into a slightly more complex interface. Things kind of look the same, but we're now kind of dived deeper into a further level of control and editability for our meshes. Now we can jump back and forth through from object to edit mode also by pressing the tab key. And the key fundamentals here are we have three different elements that we can kind of play with or edit or control, select inside of our objects. So our meshes are made up of these points. So these are our vertices. So multiple vertices. Vertices are connected together by edges. So these are our edges that we can also select. And when you have three or more, in this case four edges that are connected together, they form a face. We can select the faces as well. What determines what thing I'm selecting is these little ones at the top. So this is vertex select, this is edge select, and this is face select. And the keyboard shortcuts for those is 1, 2, 3 along the top line of your keyboard. So 1 for vertex select, 2 for edge, 3 for face. So I'm going to stick with face for now. So here I have my just this top face selected inside of my mesh, and then I can use my transform tools same as I would previously. But now when I move, so G to guide to move that around, you see I can stretch just that face, reposition that face. I could also R to rotate or S to scale that face. So we can go into these kind of granular details of really targeting different parts of our object to edit and manipulate. So how do we make this bowl? So I'm in edit mode, I'm on face select, and I'm selecting this top face. So I'm going to start by just scaling that up slightly. So this becomes a kind of tapered bottom of my bowl, base of my bowl. But then I want my bowl to come up, so I need more geometry. So to get more geometry, I can use a process called extrusion. So if I press E on my keyboard for extrude with that face selected, it's now taking that face and stretching out, extruding, squirting out more content. So this is now the body part of my bowl. I can bring that up in that extrusion. Then I'm going to press scale to scale that to make it a little bit bigger. Then I'm going to extrude another time, so E to extrude, but then rather than move it, I'm just going to press S on my keyboard to scale. And now, rather than scaling out, I'm going to scale in. This is now forming the lip of my bowl. And then if I press E again to extrude again, rather than coming up, I'm going to come down into my bowl, and things look like they're getting a bit complicated. And we've got faces overlapping other faces, but we're okay for now. Just bringing that down. And then if I press S to scale that face, the idea is there, I'm bringing that face inside of the rest of the geometry. Now I've got the inside of my bowl. Now we could just leave it like that, but another thing we could do is maybe round our bowl off slightly. So I want to kind of manipulate and pull out maybe the midpoint of these faces that go around. So if I scale that out, we get this extra bend in our bowl. But I don't have any edges to be able to select there. So I can add new edges, which is in a process called loop cuts. And the keyboard shortcut for that is to Control R, add a loop cut. So with a loop cut, I can find a face or an edge that I want to cut around. So if I'm hovering my mouse over, I'm going to say this is where I want my edge to be. I left click. Now I'm still in the loop cut mode where I can decide where I want that cut to be. I want it in the center of my bowl. So if I right click at this stage, it will default to the center of that face. Note though, with this design now, because I've got geometry on faces on the outside, but then also faces on the inside, that cut has only gone around the outside faces and not the inside faces. So with that cut selected still, so I've now got an edge select. If I press S to scale, I can scale the outer part of my bowl out a little bit. Now I've got this going on. And then another thing I want to do to really get a kind of smooth curve is to do a process called beveling. Now to bevel, the keyboard shortcut is Control B for bevel. And with bevel, with that edge selecting, I can then move my cursor around and it's starting to almost do another extrusion or a loop cut. It's creating more geometry across that line. But then to add extra lines, so extra levels of smoothness, still with this bevel kind of stretched out. If I use my scrolly wheel, every time I kind of scroll up an increment, it adds an additional loop cut. So the more lines I have here, the more geometry I have and the smoother it becomes. I don't want to go too crazy, but let's maybe put in a few loop cuts like that. Now I've got this kind of smooth outside edge of my bowl. I'm then going to repeat that process on the inside. So Control R for a loop cut, and placing that in the center. I'm also going to scale this up. But in this instance, I just want to make sure that I'm not going through my other geometry. I'm not reaching through that wall. So I'm just going to work that. So I'm just on the inside. And then again, Control B to bevel. Now this time it will remember the last bevel move that I've done and have the equivalent loop cuts in. So stretching that out so that we get the right degrees going on there. And there we have quite a nice looking bowl. If I then press Tab, I'm out of edit mode. I'm into object mode, and this is now my first model that I've made of this bowl. Now I need something to put in that bowl. So let's make a cherry. So making sure that I'm in object mode, I can then add some new mesh, and I'm going to go for a UV sphere, so a ball. I'm going to guide that up. I'm going to scale it down. And also useful keyboard shortcut is the full stop on the number pad will zoom in into whatever you have selected. I'm zooming in onto that ball, so I'm just focusing on it. If I want to get back to everything else, just scroll out. Quick way of getting to something is like focus mode. Also what's useful is our Cartesian viewports. So rather than having this orbiting camera, if I click on like the X here, I'm looking down my X-axis and I can see it from the side on. Equally, if I click on the Y, I'm looking at it from the other side, and if I click on it from the Z, I'm looking at my scene from the top. The keyboard shortcuts for those are on your number pad, so 1, 3, and 7 become those different angles. So I'm going to look down my X-axis, number 3 on the number pad, and see my ball above my bowl there. So how do we make this into a cherry? So if I go into edit mode, we'll see that this sphere is made up of lots and lots of different faces and lots of vertices and lots of edges. But with the UV sphere, actually, if we look at it from the top, number 7 on the number pad, we can see that we've got this series of faces that all meet at this one vertex, all converge and merge at that vertex at the top. Now I'm going to do a little marquee select, making sure that I've got face selection active, and select over that center bit with a little marquee, and it selects all of those faces on the top of my sphere. And then I'm going to reapply what I know from making that bowl. So if I do E to extrude, bringing the top of that up, then I can do E to extrude again, but scale it down a little bit. And then E to extrude up, so this becomes the stalk of my cherry. Okay. Now to make the top of that stalk maybe a little bit more interesting, I could press S to scale that up so it gets a little bit fatter at the top. And then maybe I want to make it have a little bend in it. So to make things bend, to make these edges bend, I'm going to need some more geometry in there, some more points around which we can rotate. So we know how to do that as well. So that's just a loop cut again. So Control R to add a loop cut. But also similar to the bevel tool, at this stage of the loop cut, before I kind of select and say this is where I want it to cut, so I'm just hovering over to say that that's the edge that I want to use. If I use my scrolly wheel on my mouse, I can add lots and lots more loop cuts, so multiple loop cuts. Now I don't want to go too crazy, but maybe I want maybe 5 loop cuts in there. So scrolling up to get 5 cuts, then pressing once, so left clicking to select. I want to leave them where they were, so then right clicking, and now I've got additional geometry points there to play with. To get that bend going on, now we could go in and select these ones and do a little rotate and maybe a move, but that can be a little bit fiddly. So instead what I'm going to do is select these faces again on the top. So again, making sure I'm on face select, number 3 on the row of numbers at the top, or the face select at the top there. Selecting those top faces. And if I come to the side here, if I were to press R to rotate, see I'm just rotating those faces that I have selected. If I right click to cancel that, and instead come up to this button at the top here. So this is called proportional editing. There's a little button here to turn it on, or it's the letter O on the keyboard, kind of toggles that on and off. So with that on, now if I press R on my keyboard, let me zoom out a little bit so we can see. So if I press R on my keyboard, you see I've now got this grey circle that's appeared. Now you may not be able to see your circle, but this is the area of influence, and we can control that area of influence by using our scrolly wheel on our mouse again. So what that does then is if I'm now manually rotating and moving those edges around, but inside of that area of influence, it will proportionally edit to that move in relation to how big that circle is. So if I do a relatively big rotation here and then scroll the wheel, you can maybe see that working. But the further I come out, the more and more it's going to manipulate my my content below. So I'm going to have it just coming up to the top of that cherry, to the top of the body of the cherry. That's now my kind of stem, my stalk of my cherry bent over. I'm then going to turn proportional editing off, just so that I like to have that off when I'm working and kind of choose as and when how I want to use it or when I want to use it. I now look at my cherry from the other side, so number 1 on my keyboard, looking down my y-axis. Maybe I want to manipulate and move around some of these, the body, so it's less of a ball and more kind of a bit more interesting as a cherry. So I'm going to use face select again. I'm going to hold down shift and just select a few of these faces over on the side here. Then come to the side, orbiting around, selecting some faces and coming to the front. Now if I press G to guide and move those around, you see it's just grabbing those faces and moving them around, just ripping them out of the cherry. So instead of that, but still with those selected, if I turn proportional editing on and do that same G to guide and move, now when I move those around, it's proportionally morphing and bringing some of those other faces across as well. So again, I can move my scrolly wheel to decide what proportion I want to move that in. So let's have something like that. Then I can reselect some more faces over on the other side. And decide here, G to guide to move. Maybe make this a little bit different over this side. But there we go. Something that looks a little bit more like that. Something that looks a little bit more interesting than just a sphere. There's my cherry. Okay, so you can spend a little bit longer on that if you want to. Now, how do I get this cherry into the bowl? So I'm going to use the rigid body physics setup to get that cherry to land inside of my bowl. So with my cherry selected, I'm going to come over to my physics panel over here and turn on rigid body physics. So it's now going to have some gravitational forces applied to it. When I press play, you see it will just fall through my bowl because my bowl is not part of that simulation. So if I then tell my bowl to also be part of it, but I don't want my bowl to fall with gravity, so I'm going to make that passive. But watch what happens here. When I press play, it's just going to come and land on top of that bowl. And the reason for that is by default, when we bring in a rigid body physics scenario, this collisions type is set to default to convex hull. And this is like it's creating this bubble around our object. It doesn't matter what that object looks like. It's just making this kind of shrink wrapping this thing to say whatever is inside of this has some sort of physics. But in this instance, I want to actually utilize the fact that it is a bowl, and I want my cherry to fall through that and be able to land in the bottom. If I change my shape type to be mesh instead, this takes a little bit more computational power and thinking. But now when I press play, I'm going to recognize that there is a mesh inside of here and be able to now fall inside of that bowl. Now, other things that you can play around with is things like sensitivity. So how close to the edge of that bowl do these things work? Let's go into wireframe mode here. Maybe we can see what's going on. So this is actually the base of my bowl. That's that bottom inner part. You see the cherry is a few millimeters, fraction of millimeters off the bottom of that bowl. Now in this scenario, that's not necessarily an issue, but that's all to do with the margin here. So I could maybe reduce that margin down a little bit to make it a little bit tighter. If you just have it on 0, it's going to take even longer to kind of think about what's happening. If I just reduce it down to 0.02 and then redo that simulation, it's now got a little bit closer to the bottom of that bowl. And I think in the grand scheme of things, all is going to be well there. So I've set up my simulation. I've got my cherry made, and the rigid body setup is working. So now I want to make lots of cherries. But before I do that, I am going to apply some materials to my cherry. So I want to make the perfect cherry, so that when I duplicate it, I've got lots of other perfect cherries. So materials is a whole other complex workflow, but the basics are as such. So by default, all of our content has a default material applied to it, which is like this mid-white material. But there's material properties panel is over here on the right hand side. So there is no materials assigned to this this object, so it just has this default material. But with the cherry selected, I'm going to create a new material, and then it's going to load up and give me materials it's now created this material 1. I can change the name here. The name doesn't really mean anything, but it's useful to name our materials so that we know what we're talking about. So I'm calling this cherry body. I'm not going to set anything up on this yet. I'm just going to assign that material to my object. But I want this one to have actually 2 materials, because I want the stem to be a different color. So if I come to the side view or the front view of my cherry here, and I go back into edit mode and get my face selection, I'm also going to switch to X-ray mode at the top here, which means that I'm able to select faces through my object. So if X-ray mode wasn't on, and I did a little marquee selection, it looks like all of this is selected, but if I look around, these ones at the back are not. So if I turn X-ray on, and the keyboard shortcut for that is Alt and Z. Now if I do that same thing of selecting those faces, look around, kind of selected all the way through. So here I'm going to do a marquee selection around all of those faces that make up the stem. Yeah. Then with those selected, I'm going to come over to the materials panel again. I'm going to plus to make another material, make it new, and call this cherry stem. Then with those faces selected, I'm going to click assign. That's going to assign that material to those stem faces that have been selected. Then out of edit mode, out of X-ray mode, back and ready. So we'll come back to materials again in a bit. So the next thing I want to do is to duplicate this one cherry. But another thing I'm going to do before I do that is, because I'm going to have lots of cherries that are going to fall down into this bowl. So this cherry should also, in its rigid body setup, potentially have mesh as its collision type, so that the cherries can fall and bounce off one another and the stems can kind of interconnect. So again, this is going to take a little bit more processing power to actually work this out, but I think that's what we need to do. So then with that cherry selected, I'm going to duplicate it. So I'm going to do Shift D to make a duplicate, then another Shift D to duplicate, Shift D, and just moving them around. So I've got a few cherries there. Then I'm going to select all of those cherries and then come to this side view here with number 3 on my keyboard. Shift D to make some copies over there. Shift D to make some copies over there. Maybe we want a few more up here as well. Lots of cherries. The more things you have, the longer it's going to take to process. It's more complex, but let's see how the simulation runs. Now before I do the simulation, I am quickly going to save my file to be something else. So let's call this cherry bowl 01, and then I'm going to press play on the timeline spacebar which is then going to work through that animation. You can see that it started falling quite nicely, quite quickly, but then it's now getting more and more complex as things are kind of those cherries are falling amongst one another with all of that mesh collision type going on. This is slowing my computer down. May also potentially be affecting the recording as well. Oh, I've got one that's about to fall out. That's exciting. So it's still wobbling and moving around, but I'm going to stop the simulation there just by pressing spacebar again. And we can see that I've now got a bowl full of cherries, so I haven't had to manually place those cherries in and rotate and move them around. I'm using this physics simulation as a way of getting this natural formation of these objects into the bowl. Now this one is about to fall out, and if we carried on the simulation, this would then just fall through space. So I haven't got a floor in my world either, so maybe I should make a floor. So if I introduce a new plane, so the add menu mesh plane, and scale that up, so I've now got a floor. So something for it to land onto. And we'll also then, if we want things to land on it, that also needs to be a rigid body and also needs to be passive. And also, just because what I want to do in the future, I'm also going to change that to be a mesh collision type as well. And so I can see that things are falling down, and this one's going to pop out. You may have seen in the example earlier, I had some scattered on the floor, and that's because I had more cherries than filled the bowl, so things kind of spread out over at the sides. So I'm going to come back to the start here, take all of, maybe not all of the cherries, some of these cherries, maybe these ones, and make a few more duplicates, more and more cherries. And maybe some that I just know are not going to get into the bowl anyway, and naturally going to fall out. Maybe come to the side here and bring some over here. Now I've now got lots and lots and lots of cherries. So I'm going to pause the recording here, but run the simulation, and then we'll see the results afterwards. Okay, so I'll see you in a bit. Okay, so that took a couple of minutes there for just that simulation to run. So it depends on the processing power of your machines and how complex your scenes are, how long that's going to take. And note that I haven't gone for the whole of the 250 frames of the timeline. I've just been watching it and waiting for a point where I think things are kind of settled and in place. And for me, that's around the 80 frame mark. But now I've got my cherries spread over my desk or my tabletop and into my bowl there. So now I could start thinking about maybe lining this up as a camera shot. But before I do that, to save on processing power, I'm also going to kind of fix that that animation in place. So this will play again should I want to, but if I wanted to go beyond that 80 frame mark, I'd have to wait for it to render some more. So at this point, I'm going to come over to my properties panel, and in this, remembering where it is, in this one here, sorry, the scene properties, we have this area called rigid body world. And if I drop down the controls there, we can see the settings for the rigid body world. I'm going to change my cache here to be the number of frames that I actually need. This is how many frames are being stored into the memory. So I'm going to go to 80 frames, and then I'm just going to click bake. And that will then bake in those moves that I've done and record them so that I can start moving things around, and it's not having to recalculate that simulation every time I do that move. I'm just going to leave my playhead on the frame 80 there. Okay, so let's think about lining up our camera so that we can see the scene. So we have a camera inside of our shot here, and we can look through our camera by clicking on this little button here, or number 0 on the number pad. We'll align our viewpoint to look through that camera. But in order to move that camera, if I were to then just orbit and move around, I'm just coming back to my freeform camera. I'm not actually controlling that camera with my controls. But I can set it to do that. And if I press the letter N on the keyboard, it brings out this sub menu at the side. I go to view, and then we've got controls for the view lock. If I click on camera to view, so lock camera to view. So now when I'm looking through the camera, let's press N again to hide that away. Now when I use my regular kind of orbiting, zooming and shift moving around moves, I'm now moving my camera around at the same time. So I'm going to line up my shot to something that I think looks quite interesting. Something like this. Maybe something like that. You can see those cherries in the bowl. So once I'm happy with where my camera is positioned, if I press N again and then turn that camera view lock off, now I can move around, but then my camera is fixed in place. So I've actually set up a separate window up here so you can see what my camera is seeing at all times. And now we can start thinking about doing some further material work and setting up some lighting. Before that, though, can we see we've got this empty void in the background here? So we've got this floor, but then nothing will be here in the background. So one thing I like to do, particularly with these kind of product shots, is to do a simple little edit and manipulation of this bit of geometry as well. So if I go into edit mode of that floor plane, on my number pad, or edge select, and select that back edge, that back wall that I've got here in my camera shot, press E to extrude up on the Z axis. So I could do E and Z to lock it in. So I've now got this back wall, but I've now got this hard kind of horizon line. If I now select that horizon line and use that bevel tool that we used before, and now bringing in a bezel on that, and I can use my scrolly wheel to change the level of bevel there. And now I've got this kind of smooth infinity curve. Although it's not a smooth infinity curve, it's kind of got these steps to it, and we can actually see those steps if we look through the camera. We can see those lines. We could also see these lines, these faces on all of our geometry. So another thing I'd like to do is press A to select everything. So I'm back in object mode, sorry. So I'm back in object mode, press A to select everything, and then right click and go Shade Auto Smooth. And this will then smooth off all of this geometry. It's like a visual trick, a visual illusion to make things look nice and smooth. Up until this point, we've been looking in the viewport shading. So what does this actually look like in our render view? So this is all to do up here. So whenever you're working, you should be in the viewport shading because it's kind of quick and easy. But at the top here, we can be in our render view. If I switch to render view, everything kind of goes grey and dark. And the reason for that is because I don't have a light inside of my scene. So how do I make a light? It's in my add menu. So add light. There's 4 different types of light. A point, a sun, a spot, and an area. This instance, I'm going to use an area light. That appears in the center of my world, and I can guide that up. Be this light above my source. So if I go back to render view, I can now see that that isn't really doing that much. I've got this slight line over the side here. So because of the scale of my scene, the light isn't big enough or powerful enough. So I'm going to press S to scale that light up slightly, but that's not really doing anything. But if I right click on it, I can do adjust light power. Then if I, with that active, I can move my cursor from side to side and it's making that light brighter or more powerful. It's now lighting up my scene. And so the difference that we're seeing now between the shaded view and the rendered view is that we need lights in the render view to be able to see what is going on. So now my scene is starting to become lit by that light. I might want to have multiple lights inside of my scene to make this into an interesting product shot. So I might duplicate my light. And if I come to my, so I have duplicated it, but if I come to my top view, I can then guide that light over to the side here. Then if I come to my front view here, I can use the rotation tool to rotate that light around. And there are other ways that you can kind of manipulate and move lights around. But just getting your head around this way of working is kind of a good place to start. So imagine that you're lighting it in the real world. Now I've got that light in place there. Then I'm going to duplicate that light and bring it over here and rotate it around to the side. Then you can play around with how near or far away those lights are. Also how powerful each of them are. So I could make this one more powerful than the others. Right clicking and adjusting the light power. More subtle light coming from one side, stronger from the other. Okay, there's our cherries all lit up. Now we want to get some materials on here so we can really see what's going on. So with these cherries, I can select one of those cherries and come to my materials panel over at the side. And because they all were duplicated after I'd made those materials, if I change the material on one of them, all of them will have that material applied to it. So we're going to do just some very simple stuff. So with that cherry body, got some controls down here. So the color of that cherry, I'm going to make into a red, moving on the color wheel, but then also changing its kind of brightness on the side there, its luminance. I might also bring the roughness down so we get kind of a shine to those cherries. A subtle shine. And then on the stem, I'm going to make that a kind of browny color. Maybe increase the roughness of those. Then for the bowl, I'm going to so I'm going to select the bowl, make a new material for that. And I'm going to call this bowl. But this, maybe a glass bowl might be interesting. So instead of the surface type being this default principled BSDF, if I click on the text there, I can choose glass BSDF. Now, the glass only works in a different, we get a slightly different response being in a different render engine. So this is struggling at the moment to try and fix this. I might have potentially crashed my system, but it's given me some kind of warnings up there about using that glass texture material. So maybe before switching to that, we should have switched render engine. But I know it's taken time, so we didn't panic. We paused and allowed the computer to catch up. But we get this glass effect now. But this isn't photorealistic glass at the moment. So what I'm going to do is switch to my render properties here. And my render engine by default is Eevee, but I want to switch to this one called Cycle. And if you're on a machine that's got a dedicated graphics card, you can change that to be GPU Compute. So it's using your graphics card for that. And also I'm going to click this denoise in the viewport. Now when I come back to my material properties, it's looking slightly different now. And so this is the glass, that the default settings for glass BSDF. And I've got this slider for roughness, and if I decrease that roughness down, the roughness of that glass is becoming less and less and less. And it's becoming this glass bowl. But because it's got this IOR value, this is all to do with how the translucency of, or the thickness of that glass material is being played. We get this kind of warping magnification of that glass because we've got those two layers going on, which actually looks kind of nice. Then for my background, let me select that background plane and apply a new material for that. Call that background. And now I can choose any color for that I like. So maybe I'll go for a kind of blue to really pop those cherries out against. And can you see one final thing that I want to maybe address here is that the when we've done that simulation, my cherries haven't quite landed on the floor plane because I used that mesh setting on it. It's not quite sitting on that floor, so we've got this gap between all of our cherries. Now we could fix that just by bringing that floor up, and maybe that will do it. Actually, I'm just selecting that floor plane and just guiding it up on the z-axis just to meet those cherries. Now everything's looking kind of nice. So one final thing I want to do is render this out. So I'm going to go over to my render properties over at the side here. So I'm in cycles. And I'm going to change my max samples to be maybe 512. That's how many times it's going to draw or cycle through, sample the image in the rendering process. By default, it's 4,000 and something. We don't need that much, so we'll go to 512. And to actually then render it, I'm going to quickly save it again, and then go to render up the top here and render image. Now that image is going to render out. I'm going to see that drawing, rendering in cycles, chugging through. We can see it processing up the top there, how many samples it's doing. You can see we've got this this kind of grain that is slowly rendering out. So render times will vary depending on the complexity of your scenes and how powerful your computers are, to allow some time for this to happen. But it's slowly going through those samples. Still, in maybe under a minute, we will have our rendered shot. So I hope that's been interesting and useful. Take your time with it. But there we have our rendered shot. So to save this, I'm just going to go to Image, Save, choose where I want to save it to. Leave all my settings on default there. Save that image, and now that's there as either a JPEG or a PNG that I can use to promote the sale of cherries or something. So using rigid body physics and a little bit of simple modeling to get a product shot in under an hour. So hope that's been useful. Do take care and see you soon. Thank you.